Hello everyone, today we're going to be learning about the Montgomery bus boycott. This is following on from our lesson last week about the event at Little Rock High School in 1957. We will be going back in time 2 years to 1955, but we are changing locations. We're going from the state of Arkansas over to Alabama now. So our title is Montgomery bus boycott. Our learning objective is to investigate the impact of Rosa Parks on the civil rights movement. And your starter is to write down what you know about segregation in the USA between 1929 and 1957. So we'll go ahead and pause the slide in just a moment. You can get your title, learning objective, and starter, and then we'll take up the starter when you're ready. You can go ahead and resume playing the video. So, looking at segregation in the USA between 1929 and 1957, we should be noting down some of the following issues. Any that you missed, you can put into your note now. First of all, we should have a note about the Jim Crow laws legally segregated the USA. Segregation was justified through the separate but equal doctrine. You might remember a couple lessons ago, we looked at a picture of two drinking fountains. One that was much higher up, it was plugged into the wall, so it was electrically cooled, and it was very clean to use, and that was the fountain for whites. We also saw a much lower fountain that actually filled from the base, similar to how an animal would drink, and that was for colored people. The government rationalized this by saying, well, they have separate drinking fountains and they're both drinking fountains. Well, we would agree that those drinking fountains were separate, but we would not agree that they were in fact equal. Carrying on, it was more accepted in the South to have segregated areas than it was in the North. And we already learned that the South was also known as the Bible Belt, that very conservative Christian area of the USA. There was a strong history of slavery in the US South, created social divides and racial divides. This was where slavery was quite dominant in the 16, 17, and even into the mid 1800s. And it takes a long time for those values to kind of rid themselves in society. So a lot of people, even in the 1950s, had memories of their own, if not memories of their parents or grandparents, talking about slavery in their society. We should be noting that blacks were not permitted to make use of white facilities. We talked about cinemas, shops, laundromats, schools. They always had separate facilities for blacks and whites, and we know that they were inherently unequal. The facilities for whites were often of higher quality than those for blacks. Systematic racism excluded Black Americans from a quality education. Following along from the Jim Crow laws and segregation, Blacks did not go to schools that were well funded. They only had Black teachers in those schools as well. And this created a cycle of poverty where young Black students would go to school, receive a lower standard of education, which meant they couldn't get a very good job, which means they didn't earn very much money. That often sent them to live in a poorer end of the city or town they were living in, which only gave them access to lower quality schools, again, restarting that cycle. So our next job is to open up our USA summary booklets and go to the glossary for Unit 3. We have 5 keywords to look at, which are Montgomery bus boycott, the Double V campaign, desegregate, Rosa Parks, and the SCLC. Now, you might have one or two of these already completed, and that's great. That'll actually make your job a little bit easier in figuring out the remaining key terms. So do go ahead and have a look at the definitions below, try to match them up. We will pause the video now. When you think you've got them in the right spot, we'll resume playing and you can double check your responses. Great, so we've had a chance to look at our key terms. We'll start off with the Montgomery bus boycott. This was led by Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. Blacks refused to use public transit for 381 days in the town of Montgomery, Alabama. The Double Victory Campaign. This was a campaign started by Black soldiers in the Second World War. They said there were two victories, one over racism at home and one over the Nazis and Japanese in the Second World War. To desegregate is to permit all races to share the same facilities according to the law. Rosa Parks was the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott. She was also a secretary at the NAACP. That was the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And the SCLC is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They staged the bus boycott alongside the NAACP. So just go ahead, have a quick look at those, check that yours are in the right order, If they are, we can go ahead and resume the video. So we're going to set some context now for the Montgomery bus boycott. This image we see on the right-hand side here, this would be a common sight in the USA in the 1950s, particularly in the US South. Now, although we can see plenty of empty seats here towards the front of the bus, there's an full empty seat here. We have one empty seat and one empty seat on this side. Black passengers were required by law to sit at the very back, and we can see the back of the bus is quite crowded. What that means is these black passengers must stand on the bus rather than taking a seat. It was also common for advertisements, which we can see on the right-hand side with the laser pointer, and even on the left-hand side, to contain fewer words and more pictures towards the back of the bus. And that was because advertisers knew, due to segregated schools, blacks actually obtained a lower standard of education, and they wanted to make their advertisements easier for those black passengers to read. Another point of consideration is to look at how busy the back of the bus is. We see there's plenty of black passengers who have filled the seats and must stand. And this is because black people in America at this time, with a lower standard of education, didn't often earn enough of an income to buy a car for themselves, which meant the majority of people who used bus systems were in fact black passengers, not white passengers. So this is going to be a very important element of the Montgomery bus boycott and the success of that bus boycott. So in our notes now, we're going to write down the rules for segregation on public transport. These were pretty widely accepted across the southern US. And the 4 points that we need to know: the front of the bus is reserved for whites at all times. Blacks must fill up the seats from the back of the bus going forward. Black Americans must not sit next to whites and must stand even if there is an empty seat in the front of the bus. If a white person gets on board and all white seats are taken, blacks must give up their seats at the back of the bus and stand for white passengers. So we'll go ahead and pause the video now and allow you some time to write down the 4 key rules for segregation on public transit. Once you're finished writing those down, you can resume playing the video. Now, like any other town in the southern US, Montgomery, Alabama had segregation laws on their public transit. Rosa Parks, she had worked at the NAACP for a number of years as a secretary, and she was a very strong supporter of equal rights. Now, as the story goes, after a long day at work, Rosa Parks gets on the bus. There's no free seats at the back, so she decides to grab a seat towards the front of the bus. As the bus is moving, more passengers are getting on, and the bus driver kindly asks her to move, but she refused. And we should note that the bus driver was actually doing this in a very kind fashion. He wasn't rude, he wasn't derogatory or racist towards Rosa Parks. He was very nice to her. But Rosa Parks kindly refused. She said, "No, I will not move to the back of the bus." Now, this put the bus driver in a rather awkward position. He needed to follow his company policy and the local law, which meant he must stop the bus, find a police officer, and have Rosa Parks arrested. Now, she was taken away by the police. She was sent to jail where she was fingerprinted, but soon she was released on bail. And this was essentially the last straw for many blacks in Montgomery, and a plan would soon be underway to try to change that local law. So what we'll do is take a couple moments to put these 4 points into our note, and then we can resume playing the video when we're finished. Now, we call this the bus boycott because boycotting something means you stop using it. To protest Rosa Parks' arrest, blacks stopped using the buses for over 381 days in Montgomery, Alabama. Most blacks in Montgomery did not own cars, so they relied on the bus company to get to and from work. In turn, the bus company relied on blacks for most of their profits. The bus company, having lost over a year of sales, actually agreed to desegregate their buses. Shortly after that, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation laws were to be removed from public transit. Now, even though blacks and whites were now equal under the law in terms of public transit, racism and discrimination would carry on for many years. If we take a look here on the right, we can actually see an image taken in Montgomery in early 1956. and this is showing Black people walking to work. We have a quotation underneath the image of a man who participated in the bus boycott. So he said, "It was hard, it was real hard. I had to a long walk, had a hard day, and had to walk even longer to get home, it seemed. But seeing all those other folks walking too, there was solidarity. We were part of something bigger than ourselves. We knew then that we were making history." And this was one of the elements that kept all the participants of the bus boycott together. They knew that if just one of them used the bus, it would break that bond of solidarity that they had, and they stuck to it. For over a year, they refused to ride the bus, and they would walk to and from work. So now we're going to have a look at a GCSE pod. All you need to do for the time being is listen to the video, and we're going to use the knowledge that we acquire in this video to create a timeline together of key civil rights events. So we'll go ahead and we'll watch that now.
Chapter 4. The Civil Rights Movement, 1950 to 1970. The period between 1930 and 1950 saw the United States of America being forced to deal with a great economic depression and involvement in the Second World War. During this period, segregation and discrimination continued to exist across the country towards Black Americans, especially in the southern states. In the post-war era of the 1950s, the race issue once again came to the forefront of American life, often threatening to destroy it. In the 1950s, the NAACP, the organization founded by W.E.B. Du Bois, began to hold nationwide protests against segregation. Their cause received a huge boost in 1954 when the Supreme Court decided that segregation in schools was unlawful and against the U.S. Constitution. The Brown versus the Board of Education case ruled that the Plessy versus Ferguson case of 1896, which essentially gave the green light for segregation in the South, was unconstitutional and recommended that it should be phased out over time. Spurred on by these events, the NAACP began to boycott bus companies across southern states, following the arrest of Rosa Parks for traveling in a white-only sector. One boycott in Montgomery caused bus revenue to fall by 70%, and after 381 days, a federal court began to desegregate the bus system across the southern state. Events at Montgomery were quickly followed by an Army regiment escorting 9 black girls into Little Rock High School in Arkansas. The presence of the Army was needed to protect the students from an angry white mob protesting against the desegregation of the school. Despite clinging on to the burning embers of segregation, the South was finally losing its grip. In 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King, who had played a vital role in the Montgomery bus protests, addressed a crowd of over 250,000 people at a protest rally in Washington. His "I Have a Dream" speech that day is viewed by many historians as a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement, because it put extreme pressure on the American government to rid the South of segregation and improve civil liberties for Black Americans. 1 year later, in 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson ensured the Civil Rights Act was passed by U.S. Congress, making racial discrimination in public places illegal. It also meant that employers could be prosecuted if they were found guilty of not providing equal job opportunities. Johnson backed this new act with the threat of cutting federal spending on states who were seen to continue segregation and inequality. However, even despite the most comprehensive civil rights laws ever introduced in America, the South seemed to cling on. As black children began to attend formerly whites-only schools and black men and women attended cinemas, the black community was spat on, verbally abused, and often physically attacked. All of this was under the noses of local law enforcement agencies who did very little to stop the abuse. Many Southerners returned to old-fashioned techniques of intimidation and violence, and the KKK witnessed a surge in its membership numbers. Almost 100 years after the Civil War, America seemed to be declaring war on itself again.
So having watched a GCSE pod, we're going to create a timeline of the significant events for Blacks in the civil rights movement between the 1930s and the 1960s. Don't worry about the precise year. What we're just going to do is arrange these events in chronological order. What I'd like you to do now is to pause the video, draw a line in your books, and try to place those events in the correct order, and we'll take that up in a few minutes' time. So you've had an opportunity to look at putting some of these events onto your timeline. Let's go ahead and take them up together. Any that you might have missed or had incorrectly, just feel free to cross them out and make sure they're added in. So we'll start off in the 1930s. We know that President Roosevelt's New Deal did not particularly help Blacks, or for a matter of fact, women. It typically gave the better jobs to younger white men and put Blacks in a position of the worst jobs that were often temporary or manual labor at best. 1940s, World War II, the Red Tails. We talked about the story of the blood transfusion of the general who could have been saved but wasn't because using blood from black soldiers would have made him into what was called a mongrel or an animal. And Executive Order 9981, that was a desegregation of the US military, allowing blacks and whites to serve alongside each other in 1946. So the 1950s, we have Brown versus the Board of Ed, also known as Brown versus Topeka, the Little Rock Nine. We've got James Meredith and Mississippi University. We have the Montgomery bus boycotts and Rosa Parks. In the 1960s, we have freedom rides and sit-ins. Freedom rides, a reminder, these were people who rode buses from the north into the segregated south as a means of protest. A sit-in is when a black person would go into a white's facility, most often a whites only diner, sit at the table, not engage with anyone, not talk to them. They would be refused service and eventually either arrested or thrown out. In the 1960s, we have Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, the Birmingham March. Stokely Carmichael, he was the founder of the Black Power movement. The 1960s, we carried on with the Black Power movement. The Black Panthers, they were a very violent group, and we also had an example of racial awareness at the Mexico Olympics in 1966. And in 1964, we had the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So just go ahead and double check that we have those on our timelines. Just match them up to the correct decade. Once you've done so, you can hit resume on the video. So our final task today, head over to your USA Summary booklet and complete the first row in this table. So just the Rosa Parks row, as we can see here, the time period she was active and her significance. What is it that she did that we still talk about and we learned about today? Don't worry about MLK, Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael. We'll cover those in future lessons. Step 2 is to ensure that all your glossary terms for units 1 and 2 are completed, as well as the activities in your summary booklets. And step number 3, use the textbook to create a mind map or revision poster about any of the following topics we've covered in the past. So you can look at the New Deal, Herbert Hoover, the Red Tails, President Roosevelt, talk about the Little Rock Nine or Little Rock High. So we'll pause the video in just a moment so we can keep this on our screen. And these are the 3 remaining tasks that we'll be working on for the duration of our lesson today.